The sun was setting as the stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the weather barn. Dust rose in clouds around the tired horses, their breaths heavy and hoarse. Catherine Morland stepped out carefully, clutching the worn carpet bag that had been her constant companion for the past 2 weeks. She had traveled 1,200 miles across rough roads and unfamiliar territories to reach a place she never thought she would find herself: the wild, untamed American West. All for a man she had never met, a man who had promised her a new life. But the sight before her was not the promise she had imagined. The barn was dilapidated, its boards creaking in the wind like an old man sighing with weariness. The farmyard was dusty, and a few chickens pecked listlessly at the ground. The entire scene spoke of poverty, neglect, and hardship. The small, rustic cabin behind the barn looked no better, barely standing against the elements. The world Catherine had entered was nothing like the one she had known in Boston. She had come here expecting nothing more than hardship, to marry a farmer of modest means who had described his home as simple. But this looked like the very picture of poverty. Her heart sank. What had she done? She opened the leather flap of her carpet bag and pulled out the few things she had left from her life in Boston: a good dress, a pearl necklace from her mother, and the letters Thomas Harrington had sent her. In each of those letters, he had painted a picture of a life that was stable, even if humble, a life of hard work and quiet contentment. She had believed him. She had been desperate enough to believe him. The man who stepped out from behind the barn to greet her did little to assuage her fears. Thomas was dressed in worn work clothes, his shirt stained with dirt and sweat, his hands calloused from labor. He looked like any other common laborer, nothing like the well-dressed gentleman she had imagined from his letters. "Miss Morland, I presume?" He tipped his hat, his voice deep and kind, but there was no mistaking the roughness of his appearance. Catherine nodded, her smile forced. "Mr. Harrington," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. She had expected someone more refined, someone who would offer her the life of comfort she had dreamed of, even if it was on a small farm. Instead, she found herself facing a man who looked like he belonged in the fields, not in a drawing room. "Welcome to my farm," he said, his smile genuine but unreadable. He gestured toward the cabin. "It may not look like much, but I trust you'll find it comfortable for the night." Catherine looked around again, her thoughts racing. This could not be the place he had promised her. There was no sign of the wealth he had alluded to, no trace of the life she had imagined. The barn was falling apart, the land was dry, and the house, well, if it could even be called a house, was nothing more than a small, rustic cabin. But as she stepped inside, a strange sense of discomfort crept over her. The cabin was sparse, yes, but there were little details that did not match the image of a poor farmer. The thick, warm blanket on the bed was of an expensive quality, its stitching precise and delicate. On the small wooden table in the corner, an imported coffee pot sat beside a leather-bound book, clearly well cared for. Fine china, though a few pieces were chipped, lined the shelves above the stove. A quiet elegance clung to the place, a stark contrast to the battered barn outside. Thomas watched her as she took in the scene. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," he said, his voice still warm, though his eyes seemed distant. "You'll take the bed. Tomorrow will be a long day, Miss Morland." Catherine stared at him, a shiver running down her spine. There was something strange in his tone, something that unsettled her. She had expected to find poverty, hardship, and struggle. But this was something else entirely. A man who would let her sleep in a fine bed while he took the coal barn. A man who would keep such fine things in a cabin meant for workers. She didn't know what to make of it. "Tomorrow," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean by that?" Thomas smiled, though it was a mysterious, knowing smile that only deepened her confusion. "You'll see in the morning. For now, rest. We have much to discuss." The sound of the door closing behind him was followed by an eerie silence. Catherine stood there for a moment, the weight of the night pressing in on her. She sank onto the bed, her mind spinning with questions, none of which had answers. She wanted to trust Thomas, but everything about this place, the barn, the cabin, his behavior, felt like a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the last light of the sun was fading behind the hills. What had she gotten herself into? And why did Thomas smile so cryptically, as though he were hiding something more? Something she was yet to understand. The night stretched on, and Catherine lay in the bed, sleepless and restless, awaiting whatever was to come with both fear and a strange sense of anticipation. Dawn broke over the quiet farm, painting the world in soft shades of gold and pink. Catherine awoke to the smell of something far richer than what she had expected. An elaborate breakfast of eggs, fresh-baked bread, bacon, and sweet pastries. It was far too fine for a poor farmer's table. As she dressed and prepared herself for the day, the thoughts in her head were racing. How could this man have led her to believe he was struggling when he had the means to provide such luxury? It didn't make sense. She was still grappling with the reality of the previous evening when Thomas knocked on the door, now dressed in freshly laundered clothes. His rough appearance had been replaced with a crisp shirt and trousers that fit him perfectly. His hair was neatly combed, and his clean-shaven face made him look almost unrecognizable from the man who had greeted her the night before. As they sat at the table, sharing a breakfast that could rival any high society feast, Catherine couldn't help but notice his perfect manners, his measured speech, and his ease with which he navigated the table. He was nothing like the man she had imagined. He wasn't just a farmer. He was something else entirely. A sudden knock interrupted her thoughts. A fine carriage rolled up the dirt path, and a man stepped out, dressed in a suit that looked to have been made in one of the finest shops in Boston. The reverend who arrived was someone Catherine didn't recognize, but his attire and bearing made it clear he was no ordinary clergyman. He greeted Thomas with a kind of deference, and Catherine caught the faintest exchange of glances between them. There was something about the way they looked at each other that made her stomach tighten. As the Reverend approached her to introduce himself, she overheard a whispered comment. "Are you sure about this approach, Thomas? Are you certain she will accept?" The words were spoken so softly she wasn't sure if she had imagined them, but they sent a chill down her spine. What approach? What were they hiding? The ceremony that followed was simple, conducted outside the cabin with the sun rising behind them, but the whole event felt oddly out of place. Catherine had expected a small affair, but this felt more like a show. Thomas wore a ring that was simple, yes, but the quality of the gold was undeniable. It was one of the finest pieces she had ever seen. "You're officially Mrs. Harrington now," Thomas said after the ceremony, his voice sincere, yet there was something in his eyes she couldn't place. Catherine barely had time to process the words before he was leading her away from the cabin. "It's time I show you your new home," he said, his voice low, almost like a secret he was sharing. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Wasn't this their home? Wasn't this the place they were supposed to start their life together? She opened her mouth to ask, but he cut her off before she could speak. "This isn't where we'll live, Catherine. This is where I started, not where we'll end up." Bewildered and confused, Catherine climbed into the wagon beside him. They set off down a narrow path, the wheels creaking and the horses pulling them through the fields. It didn't take long before Catherine's confusion grew into something more like shock. As they traveled, the landscape changed before her eyes. The once dry land stretched out in every direction, giving way to fields that seemed to go on forever. Workers waved at them as they passed, tipping their hats with a familiar, respectful greeting. "Morning, Mr. Harrington, sir." The words echoed in Catherine's mind. Mr. Harrington? Thomas was a mister, not a simple farmer. Her voice shook as she finally asked, "How many acres does this land cover?" Thomas, sitting casually beside her, barely looked at her as he responded, "About 3,000, give or take." 3,000 acres? This wasn't just a farm. This was an estate. Catherine could hardly breathe as they passed massive barns, silos, and other buildings that spoke of wealth far beyond what she had imagined. The fields were lush, the crops healthy and thriving. The workers, far from being the poor laborers she had expected, were well-dressed and appeared to work with a kind of ease that was rare in these parts. They were not struggling to survive. They were working on something much larger, much more prosperous. It didn't make sense. How had you missed all of this? The wagon finally crested a ridge, and as they reached the top, Thomas pulled the horses to a stop. He pointed out ahead. There, that's home. Catherine looked down the hill, her eyes widening in disbelief. What she saw below was not a simple farmhouse, but a grand estate that could rival any mansion she had ever seen in Boston. It was a three-story manor, with white columns stretching up into the sky. The grounds were manicured with precision, fountains and gazebos dotting the landscape like something out of a dream. It looked like a place for royalty, not a farmer and his new bride. Staff were lined up outside, waiting to greet them. A butler, maids, groundskeepers, and a cook. Catherine's legs grew weak beneath her, and she almost couldn't stand. She had been married to a man she thought had nothing but a small farm. And now, here she was, standing on the doorstep of a grand estate, surrounded by servants and wealth that made her question everything she thought she knew. "You lied to me," she finally blurted, her voice cracking with disbelief. Thomas turned to her, his expression unreadable, though there was no trace of guilt in his eyes. "I never lied to you, Catherine. I'll let you think what you needed to think." His words hung in the air, cryptic and full of mystery. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would a man with all of this need a mail-order bride?" He smiled faintly. "That's exactly the question, and the answer isn't what you expect." Catherine didn't know what to think or how to feel. She had come here expecting to find hardship, poverty, and maybe even despair. But what she had found instead was a mystery, one she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. Catherine stood frozen at the entrance to the grand manor, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. She had expected a small farmhouse, maybe a modest home. Not this. The three-story estate before her gleamed in the sunlight, its white columns and ornate detailing more fitting for a mansion in the heart of Boston than a humble farm. As she took in the manicured gardens, the fountains, and the neatly trimmed hedges, a wave of disbelief washed over her. This was no simple farm. This was wealth beyond anything she had imagined. Her stomach churned as she turned to Thomas, hoping for an explanation, but all she saw was his calm, unreadable expression. "You lied to me," she said, the words barely escaping her lips, a mixture of anger and hurt. Thomas didn't flinch. His response was steady, measured. "I never lied. I'll let you think what you needed to think." His words stung more than the truth would have. He had deceived her, not with outright lies, but by omission, allowing her to build an image in her mind that was entirely false. "Why?" she demanded, her voice trembling with confusion. "Why would you do this?" He didn't answer immediately, choosing instead to guide her up the marble steps into the manor. Staff stood waiting by the door, maids, butlers, a cook, all of them ready to attend to her needs. Catherine's legs felt weak as she walked past them, their respectful nods doing little to ease the weight of her growing realization. She had married a man who was far from the poor farmer she had imagined. Inside, the manor was just as grand as the outside. The ceilings were high, the furniture elegant, and the walls adorned with fine art and exquisite tapestries. Everything was polished, carefully maintained, as though the house itself was a reflection of something much larger, much more refined. The sight of it only deepened her confusion. She couldn't reconcile the image of the rough, callous man she had met at the barn with the owner of such a place. "This can't be real," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. He watched her silently, his face showing no hint of emotion. He led her through the rooms until they reached a large, beautifully furnished bedroom. Hers, it seemed. The bed was massive, draped in silk curtains, the floor covered in plush Persian rugs. She walked over to the wardrobe, which was full of dresses that seemed perfectly tailored to her size, each one more luxurious than the last. Expensive fabrics, the latest fashions, everything a woman of high society would wear. She couldn't believe it. How had he known her size? How had he planned all this? The maid, a quiet young woman named Sarah, appeared as if on cue, offering her assistance. Catherine's eyes flickered nervously over the room before meeting Sarah's. "Everything is so beautiful," she said, her voice laced with uncertainty. "How could this all be here? I thought." Her words trailed off, but Sarah seemed to understand. "Mr. Harrington is a good man. Mrs. Harrington," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "He's been hurt before. Badly. That's why he does things this way." The words sent a shiver down Catherine's spine. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but Sarah was gone before she could open her mouth. The confusion only deepened. She was married to a man who had wealth beyond measure, yet he had chosen to send for a mail-order bride, a woman he had never met, someone he could have had no guarantee would accept his life. Why would he do that? Catherine couldn't understand it. She had seen the life he led in his letters, but she had assumed that the modest means he had described were just that. Modest, humble, simple. She had expected a farm, maybe a few animals, and a life of hard work. Instead, she was staring at a grand house, with servants who greeted her as though she were a queen. As the evening approached, Catherine's head swirled with questions she had no answers for. She dressed quickly, donning an emerald silk gown that felt out of place in the quiet of the country. When she descended the stairs, Thomas was waiting for her in the formal dining room. He was dressed in a tailored suit, the fabric rich and dark, his hair neatly styled. For a moment, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked like a man who belonged in a ballroom, not on a farm. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, his voice sincere, but his eyes carried a depth she couldn't quite read. Catherine barely registered the compliment. "You owe me an explanation," she said firmly, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. Thomas's expression darkened slightly, but he nodded. "You deserve one," he said, leading her to the table. The room was set with crystal glassware, silver utensils, and fine china. The dinner was elaborate, but Catherine barely tasted the food. All she could think about was the house, the wealth, the mystery. As the dinner continued, Thomas began to speak, his voice calm and steady, but there was a hint of something deeper in his words. "5 years ago," he began, "I was engaged to a woman named Margaret Ashford." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Margaret Ashford? The name was familiar. She had seen it in the letters Thomas had sent. She was beautiful, charming. He continued, his voice distant, as if he were recalling a memory that still pained him. "But one day, I overheard her confession. She didn't love me. She loved my estate. I wasn't enough for her." Catherine felt a pang of sympathy for him, but also a surge of anger. This was the man she had married, the man who had been betrayed by someone who should have loved him. "I called off the wedding, and after that, I realized something." His eyes met hers. "No one ever wanted me. They wanted this." He gestured vaguely to the manor around them. "So I began to close myself off. I didn't want a woman who would choose me for my wealth. I wanted someone who would choose me for me." Catherine sat back in her chair, stunned. She had thought he was hiding his wealth to protect his pride, but now she realized it was something far deeper. He had been hurt, just like she had. She had known betrayal, the loss of her family's fortune, but he had known loneliness and the bitterness of being valued only for what he could offer. "So you tested me?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "I observed you. I saw that you were different. I needed someone who understood hardship, who valued character." His voice softened. "I needed someone who would see me, not this." He waved his hand around, gesturing to the house, the wealth, the land. "And if you want to leave, Catherine, I'll let you go. I won't stop you, but I wanted to give you a choice." Catherine was stunned into silence. He would let her go, just like that. He wouldn't force her to stay. She wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or betrayed. "I wanted to know if you would choose me," he said softly. "Not my wealth, not my land. Me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Catherine's mind raced. Could she stay? Could she really accept this life with a man who had tested her so thoroughly? She didn't know. But in that moment, she realized one thing. Thomas Harrington had built his life on something far more valuable than wealth. He had built it on trust, and that was something she was still trying to understand. Catherine descended the grand staircase, her emerald silk dress sweeping the polished floor as she made her way to the dining room, her pulse quickening with each step. The transformation from a simple farm to this opulent world was dizzying, but she knew she had to face Thomas. He stood at the end of the room, dressed in formal evening clothes, his eyes lighting up when he saw her, though his admiration only deepened the storm brewing inside her. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the explanation she demanded. The dinner table was set with crystal, silver, and the finest china, far beyond anything she had imagined this life to offer. She sat down, her posture stiff, her mind racing. As the meal unfolded, she steeled herself and finally said it, her voice controlled but firm. "You owe me an explanation." Thomas, ever the gentleman, took a deep breath and leaned in, his gaze heavy. He began his story with quiet intensity, speaking of a time 5 years ago when he had been engaged to a Boston socialite, Margaret Ashford. He had overheard her confessing that she didn't love him, but loved the wealth his estate would bring. That betrayal shattered him, leading him to call off the wedding. Catherine listened intently as Thomas revealed that 3 more women had pursued him, all seeking his fortune, never his heart. It was then that his cynicism toward love had taken root. He confessed that his deep loneliness, coupled with his disillusionment with society's pursuit of wealth, led him to make a decision. He wanted someone who would choose him, not his estate. "I needed someone who understood hardship, valued character," he explained, his voice soft yet raw. Catherine's eyes softened, a flicker of empathy stirring within her, though her confusion lingered. She looked at him, torn, and asked, "So you tested me?" He nodded. "I observed you. Everything told me you were different." She inhaled slowly, considering his words, but his confession only deepened the complexity of her feelings. "The marriage is legal, but unconsummated," he continued, his eyes searching hers for any sign of what she might decide. "If you won't leave, I'll provide for you. You'll want for nothing." Catherine's heart ached as she processed his offer. "You just let me go," she whispered, a strange blend of disbelief and sorrow lacing her voice. "I want a willing partner, not a captive," he replied. His words lingered between them, and she found herself caught in an emotional storm, uncertain whether to stay or go. Her past echoed in the back of her mind. The abandoned engagement, the betrayal by the man who had once promised her a future. She was no stranger to heartbreak, but this man, despite his wealth, seemed as vulnerable as she. She found herself retreating to the solitude of their room, her emotions a tangle of doubt and longing. As she searched through the drawers in a moment of distraction, she discovered a journal hidden beneath a locked compartment. Opening it, she read the final entry written by his late mother, a woman whose love for Thomas had been evident in every word. The entry spoke of Thomas's innate kindness, his generosity, and the heartbreak of seeing him lose faith in people who sought him only for his riches. Her final wish was simple. "I pray he finds someone who sees his soul, not his fortune." It was in that moment that Catherine realized Thomas wasn't the man who had deceived her. He was simply protecting himself, just as she had once done. Both of them had been wounded by betrayal, and neither wanted to risk opening their hearts again. The heavy weight of this realization made her question everything, her own role in this strange, unexpected union. She closed the journal and sat down, her mind spinning. As she struggled with her emotions, The thought of his vulnerability, the sense that he had been honest in his own way, began to settle in her heart. Still, the truth remained a tangled knot. The confrontation wasn't over. It was only when she returned downstairs for dinner that she realized it was far from a simple matter of forgiveness. Just as she prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A visitor was coming, one who would surely change everything once again. The morning sun bathed the gardens in golden light, casting long shadows over the estate as Catherine walked among the flowers, her thoughts still in turmoil after the dinner the night before. She hadn't yet come to a decision, and the weight of Thomas's confession, his offer to let her go, was heavy on her heart. But before she could dwell further, the sound of a carriage approaching drew her attention. As the sleek vehicle rolled to a stop, her stomach tightened, an instinctive feeling of unease stirring within her. A tall woman stepped out, impeccably dressed in the latest fashions, an elegant, refined figure who clearly did not belong in this humble estate. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as the woman's gaze met hers, a cold, calculating smile spreading across her face. Margaret Ashford, she introduced herself, her voice smooth, dripping with insincerity. "I've come to congratulate the newlyweds," she added, but the underlying tone was anything but congratulatory. Catherine stood frozen, sensing there was more to this visit than mere pleasantries. Margaret, with her sharp, practiced charm, wasted no time in making her intentions known. "I do hope you're adjusting well," she said, her eyes flicking over Catherine's simple dress as though assessing her worth. "You poor dear, this must be quite the shock." The false sympathy in Margaret's voice was palpable, and Catherine felt a surge of discomfort flood her chest. Margaret continued, her words sweet but biting. "You must realize Thomas has a history of, well, let's just say he collects women only to grow bored and move on. I'd be careful if I were you." Catherine's stomach twisted at the insinuation, but before she could respond, Margaret added, "Has he even touched you? This marriage isn't real, you know." The doubt Margaret planted in her mind lingered like a shadow, and Catherine, caught off guard, didn't know how to defend herself. As she struggled to form a response, Thomas emerged from the manor, his presence immediately cooling the tension in the air. His sharp eyes locked on Margaret, his face transforming into an expression of icy disdain. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but filled with authority. Margaret, unflinching, didn't answer directly. Instead, she taunted him. "I'm warning this poor girl. She deserves to know what she's gotten herself into. You're not the man you claim to be, Thomas." Her words echoed in the stillness of the garden, and the staff, sensing the rising conflict, gathered at the edges of the grounds, watching with bated breath. Thomas's gaze never left Margaret's, his jaw set in determination. "Get off my property," he ordered, his voice a command, but Margaret stood her ground, unwilling to be dismissed so easily. "Not until she knows the truth," she countered, her gaze flicking to Catherine, the victor's smile still curling on her lips. "He's always been like this, using women until he grows tired of them." Catherine, her heart racing, turned to Thomas, a mixture of hurt and confusion clouding her thoughts. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret's accusations rang in her ears, and the seeds of doubt began to take root, though she knew deep down that Thomas wasn't like the men she had known before. Still, the question hung heavy between them. Thomas stepped closer, his voice firm. "That's a lie," he said, his words sharp, cutting through the tension. But Catherine, still reeling from the morning's confrontation, couldn't help herself. "Then tell me everything. All of it," she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. She needed the truth, all of it, no more secrets. Thomas hesitated, his eyes darkening as he spoke, recounting the painful history he had tried to bury. "After Margaret, there were 2 more women," he began, his voice strained with the weight of his confession. Both of them wanted me for my wealth, just like her. I never led them on. I never promised them anything. He paused, taking a steadying breath. But after all of them, I realized something. I would rather die alone than live with a lie. So I stopped pretending, stopped seeking a woman who wanted my money. Margaret sneered, her lips curling into a smug expression. This whole mail-order bride charade isn't a lie, she spat. You think you're so clever, Thomas, but you're just as much a fraud as all the rest of us. Her words stung, but Thomas's face remained unchanged, resolute. He turned to Catherine, his gaze unwavering. I'm not a fraud. I never led you to believe anything that wasn't true. You've always had a choice. But Catherine, her emotions torn between anger, confusion, and a newfound sympathy, was left in a whirlwind of uncertainty. The silence between them was thick, each word of Margaret's still echoing in her mind. She stood there, caught in the center of a storm she hadn't expected. Margaret's presence in the garden only intensified her turmoil. Tell me the truth, then, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of doubt. The air around them was heavy with tension as everyone waited for Catherine to speak, to make the choice that would determine the course of her future. Margaret's eyes gleamed with the hope that Catherine would abandon Thomas. But deep down, Catherine knew she had to make her own decision. She had to confront the man she had married, the man she was slowly starting to understand, even as the doubt lingered. What would she say? What would she choose? Catherine stood in the garden, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The tension between Thomas, the man who had shown her both kindness and mystery, and Margaret, whose cruel words had planted seeds of doubt, gnawed at her. The afternoon sun was high, casting long shadows over the estate as Margaret's accusations still hung in the air. Catherine felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to fall into the unknown or turn back to the safety of the world she knew, where she had always been a pawn in the hands of others. But something inside her stirred, a quiet strength, born from the pain she had carried for so long. Margaret's words, designed to tear Thomas down, were too sharp, too venomous, and Catherine realized that in her bitterness, Margaret was trying to make her see the worst in him. She knew what it was like to be judged based on false assumptions. She had been discarded by a man who once claimed to love her, only to abandon her when her family's fortune crumbled. She knew that heartache all too well, and suddenly, she felt a fierce sense of empathy for Thomas, for the man who had been bruised by love, just as she had. She turned her gaze to Margaret, her voice cold and steady. You're right about one thing, she began, her eyes locking onto the other woman's with unflinching clarity. I am poor. My family lost everything. But that taught me to recognize truth from performance. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, feeling the weight of her words as they fell from her lips. Right now, I'm watching a desperate woman who lost something real and is trying to reclaim it by destroying something else. Margaret's face twisted with outrage, but Catherine didn't flinch. You've tried to manipulate me, to make me doubt the one person who's been honest with me, she continued, her voice rising. But the truth is, Thomas didn't trick me. He gave me a choice. He could have bought a bride, but he didn't. He wanted someone who would value him without wealth. He wanted someone who'd see him for who he is, not what he has. She paused, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked directly at Thomas, her gaze softening. That's not deception. That's wisdom earned through pain. Pain I understand because I've felt it too. Margaret stood in stunned silence, her usual composure shaken, but Catherine wasn't finished. She turned to face Thomas, her voice now quiet but resolute. I know that you didn't tell me everything, but I understand why you didn't. You were protecting yourself, and I understand that more than you know. She felt a tightness in her chest as she spoke, realizing how much she had come to respect him, how much she had come to care for him. You don't need to protect me anymore, she said, her voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not afraid of the truth anymore. A look of relief passed over Thomas's face, his jaw relaxing as he stepped closer to her. He reached out, gently taking her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low with gratitude. But Catherine smiled, her heart full of a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Yes, I did," she replied simply. They stood together for a moment, the storm between them settling. And for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, Catherine felt a sense of peace settle within her. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay, to fight for something real, for the man who had been brave enough to trust her, even when he had nothing left to give. The silence between them was a balm, and as they walked back to the house, hand in hand, Catherine's thoughts drifted to the future. She couldn't deny the fear that still lingered within her, the fear of losing herself in a life she hadn't planned for. But she also knew that she had the power to shape her own destiny. She wasn't just Thomas's wife. She was Catherine Morland, a woman who had the strength to make her own decisions, to carve out her own place in this strange new world. That night, after Margaret had been sent on her way, Catherine found herself alone in the quiet of the manor. She had spent the day in turmoil, but now, with the weight of her decision lifted, she could breathe a little easier. She sat at the small desk in the corner of her room, her thoughts swirling as she picked up the letter her mother had written to her years ago, just before her family's fall from grace. The words, once filled with the promise of a different future, now seemed bittersweet, a reminder of the woman her mother had been before the world had turned its back on them. Her mother had always believed in her strength, had always told her that no matter what happened, she could find a way to survive. And now, as Catherine looked at her reflection in the mirror, she realized that her mother had been right. She had survived not just the loss of wealth, but the loss of faith in herself. And she had found something worth fighting for again. Thomas. She smiled at the thought, her heart fluttering as she thought of him. He had been hurt, yes, but he had also been brave enough to let her see the truth. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to face it alone. She walked to the window, the moonlight spilling into the room, casting long shadows on the floor. She could see the sprawling land that stretched out before her, the vastness of it both intimidating and exhilarating. This was her new home, a place she had never imagined, but now it felt like a place she could belong. The question that had haunted her since she first stepped off the stagecoach lingered in her mind. Was this really what she wanted? And for the first time, she didn't feel the need to answer it right away. She had time, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid to take it. Thomas had given her that. And maybe, just maybe, she could build something here, something real. As the night stretched on, Catherine felt her resolve strengthen. She had made her choice. She was staying. And whatever the future held, she would face it with courage, alongside the man who had chosen her not for her wealth, but for her heart. 6 months had passed since Catherine's decision to stay. And in that time, the changes in her life had been more profound than she ever could have imagined. The town had accepted her, not as the wife of a wealthy man, but as Catherine Morland, a woman with her own purpose and identity. She had found a calling in teaching the children of a local school, a simple wooden building that smelled of chalk and the earthiness of the surrounding landscape. It wasn't the grandest of places, but it was hers. Every morning, she arrived with a sense of pride, her lesson plans in hand, ready to give her students something she had always valued: the opportunity to learn. The children, eager and attentive, had come to admire her, their bright eyes following her every word as she guided them through their lessons. In those moments, Catherine felt truly at home, knowing that she was shaping their futures, just as her own had been shaped by the lessons of hardship and resilience. It was a life that gave her satisfaction in ways she had never expected. The feeling of community had seeped into her, and each day, she walked to the school with her head held high, the whispers that had once dogged her every step fading into the background. It wasn't just the children who had accepted her. it was the town. The shopkeepers greeted her with warmth. The townsfolk nodded respectfully when she passed. She had found her place here, not as a mere accessory to her husband's wealth, but as a woman with value in her own right. And yet, as much as she had begun to embrace this life, there were moments when her mind wandered to the vast estate that stretched beyond the town. At times, she would catch sight of Thomas standing in the doorway of their home, watching her with a quiet pride, his gaze following her as she made her way to the schoolhouse. He never said anything about it, but she knew the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had given her the first time he had seen her in that green dress, as though she were something precious, something worth holding on to. The same look he had given her after she had chosen to stay. Catherine had learned much about Thomas in the months that had passed. She had learned that beneath the stoic, wealthy exterior was a man who had been shaped by loss and betrayal. A man who had not only lost faith in the world, but in himself. She had learned about his late parents, how they had both passed when he was still young, leaving him to carry the burden of a vast estate alone. And while he had accumulated wealth, he had also accumulated loneliness, the weight of being judged only for what he had rather than who he was. But with each passing day, she saw him differently. She saw him not as a man defined by his wealth, but as someone who had fought to protect his heart, someone who had spent so many years alone, afraid of trusting anyone, even those closest to him. It was in the quiet moments, in the soft exchanges they shared, that Catherine began to understand him fully. Whether it was sitting together in the library late at night, reading in comfortable silence, or walking through the fields, discussing the harvest and the coming winter, they were building something together, slowly but surely. Their marriage, once shrouded in uncertainty, was now rooted in something real. Every conversation, every touch, every shared look brought them closer, peeling away the layers of doubt and fear they had both carried. As the months went by, Thomas had made a habit of watching her teach, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, his presence a silent support. Catherine would often catch sight of him, a slight smile playing on her lips as she saw him watching from afar, his arms crossed, his gaze soft but full of admiration. It was clear to her now that he was proud of her, proud of the woman she was becoming. He no longer seemed like the enigmatic man who had once kept so much of himself hidden. He was more open, more vulnerable, allowing her to see the man beneath the wealth and the walls he had built around himself. In turn, Catherine had begun to trust him in ways she hadn't expected. She had thought that his wealth would always be a barrier, a reminder of the deception that had once clouded their relationship, but she realized now that it wasn't the wealth that mattered. It was the way he had shown her his heart, the way he had made space for her in his life. And so, on a cool autumn evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, Catherine found herself walking home from the schoolhouse with Thomas at her side. The town had quieted for the evening, the shops closing, the streets emptying as the townsfolk settled in for the night. As they walked hand in hand, Catherine couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging, a deep-rooted peace that had eluded her for so long. The path they walked was familiar now, the way home from the schoolhouse something that had become part of the rhythm of her days. They talked about the students, the progress they had made, the plans for the coming months. The conversation was easy, comfortable, as though they had been partners for a lifetime. Thomas's hand, strong and warm in hers, was a constant presence, reassuring her that she had made the right choice. "You've done well, Catherine," he said softly, his voice low and full of admiration. "The children adore you." Catherine smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never imagined that she would find such fulfillment in teaching, and yet, every day, she saw the fruits of her labor. Children who were learning, growing, finding hope in the education she gave them. It was a feeling unlike any other. "It's not just me," she replied, her voice gentle. "It's all of us. I'm just one part of it." Thomas nodded, his eyes glinting with something that spoke of pride and appreciation. But it's your heart that makes the difference, he said, his words carrying the weight of truth. As they continued on, the path leading them toward their home, Catherine reflected on the journey they had taken together. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments of doubt, moments of fear, but she had never been more certain of anything in her life. She had found something real with Thomas, something that transcended wealth and deception. It was trust, understanding, and a deep, unspoken connection that had grown between them over time. They weren't the same people who had first met in the dusty town, uncertain of their futures. They had built something from nothing, a love that had weathered the storms of their pasts and emerged stronger. They had found peace in the quiet moments, in the simple, everyday things that made their life together unique. As they reached the manor, Catherine felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't just a wife. She was a partner, a woman with her own voice, her own purpose. And as they entered the house together, Thomas's hand still holding hers, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. They were no longer strangers, no longer two people bound by circumstance. They were a true partnership built on love, trust, and mutual respect. And that, she realized, was the greatest wealth of all. In that moment, as they shared a quiet dinner together in the warmth of their home, Catherine knew that the life they had built was just the beginning. It wasn't the land or the gold that had brought them together. It was something deeper, something far more valuable, the love and understanding they had found in each other. The kiss they shared that evening, tender and full of promise, was the culmination of months of growth, of learning to trust, of learning to love not just the man with wealth, but the man who had shown her the value of a real connection. As they stood in the soft glow of the firelight, Catherine knew that this was only the beginning of their story, and for the first time in her life, she was certain that she had found where she truly belonged. The moonlight streamed in through the window, casting a soft glow over the land they had come to call home, and Catherine, her heart full, whispered softly, "Do you ever regret the deception?" Thomas, his gaze steady and full of love, met her eyes. "Every day, and not at all." She smiled, a deep, knowing smile, as she whispered back, "I see you now. That's what matters." And in that moment, everything fell into place. Their pasts, their fears, and the years they had spent apart, all faded into the background, leaving only the two of them, standing together in the warmth of a love that had been built on truth, patience, and the courage to embrace the unknown. Their reflection in the window, silhouetted against the vast, moonlit land, spoke of a future yet to be written, but one they would write together, hand in hand, with no more secrets between them.